At 28 years old, I was fired in 15 minutes. I didn't even have time to take a deep breath. But before leaving, I did something my boss thought was ridiculous, and which, the next day at 8 a.m., pulled the rug right out from under him. What happened after that shook the entire company, and I can still smell that office when I remember it all. But before we continue, check if you're already subscribed to the channel and drop a comment below. Where are you watching this video from? We love knowing how far our stories are reaching. The digital clock on the conference room wall read 2 p.m. when my life turned upside down. I worked as a senior data analyst at Vertice Solutions, a tech company geared toward the financial market, right in the heart of New York City. I had been in that place for almost 3 years. 3 years of waking up before 6 a.m., taking the packed subway, arriving before everyone else, and leaving after most people had already eaten dinner. I didn't complain. I never complained. It was the kind of job I had carefully chosen, in a field I genuinely loved, data analysis, predictive modeling, the kind of stuff most people find boring but to me always felt like a sort of treasure hunt hidden within numbers. The company had a massive contract with a client in the banking sector, the Meridian Group. It was their biggest client, responsible for nearly 40% of their quarterly revenue. And the person who handled the technical side of that contract, who built the dashboards, who delivered the reports the client used to make decisions involving millions of dollars, was me. Not because anyone had formally asked me to take all of that on. It just happened naturally. I kept doing it, I kept growing within that project, I kept solving the problems that popped up without making a fuss, and one day I looked in the mirror and realized I knew more about the Meridian account than anyone else in that office. Including my manager. My immediate manager was named Bradley. He was in his early 40s, always dressed sharp, hair slicked back with that gel you can smell strongly even from a distance, the kind of guy who talks a lot in meetings but says very little of substance. Bradley was good with words. He knew how to turn results into action movies. On his slides, everything had impact, drama, numbers in huge fonts with red arrows pointing up. The problem was that I produced those numbers. The analysis was mine. The methodology was mine. The code that ran overnight on the servers, the one that made me wake up at 3 a.m. in my apartment to check if the automation had worked properly, was mine. He presented. I executed. At first, I thought this was just part of the corporate game. That one day someone above Bradley would realize where the real work was actually coming from. That my time would come. I was patient for a long time, maybe too patient, and that patience slowly morphed into a kind of quiet resignation that I didn't even notice starting to weigh me down. But patience has an expiration date, and mine expired on that Tuesday afternoon, when Bradley walked into the conference room with an expression I had never seen on him, a mix of nervousness and arrogance which, combined in those proportions, is the most dangerous concoction you can find in a workplace. He closed the door behind him with a little too much care, the kind of care people take when they're about to say something they know is going to hurt. Just the two of us in the room. He looked at me for 2 seconds before pushing a piece of paper across the glass table. It was a termination notice. My name at the top, the HR director's signature at the bottom, and in the middle, a short, cold paragraph stating that the company had decided to restructure the analytics team and that my profile no longer fit the organization's new strategic guidelines. I read it twice. Not because I didn't understand it the first time, but because my brain was trying to process the absolute coldness of it all. The disconnect between what that paper said and what I knew was the reality of that place. 3 years. 3 years of dedication, sleepless nights, weekends I sacrificed without a single complaint, and that right there was what I got in return. A piece of paper filled with corporate jargon, a closed room, and Bradley on the other side of the table trying to look serious and fair at the same time, a combination that just didn't work on his face. He gave me 15 minutes to wrap up whatever I was doing, pack up my personal belongings, and hand my laptop over to HR. 15 minutes. I nodded, stood up slowly, and walked out of the room without saying a single word. I went back to my desk. My computer screen was still open with a Python script I had started tweaking that morning, part of the automation that ran Meridian's weekly reports, one of the most critical pieces of the entire project. I sat down, took one deep breath, and then, with a calm that surprised even me, I started doing what I needed to do. I opened the file manager with smooth, deliberate movements. I went folder by folder, carefully. Everything that was genuinely mine went onto a flash drive I always kept in my purse out of habit. Methodologies I had personally developed off the clock. Notes on processes I had created during late nights in my apartment. Documentation of my reasoning that had never been formalized in any company system because no one had ever bothered to ask. My analysis notebook, where I handwrote the patterns I observed in Meridian's data week by week, went straight into my bag. What stayed behind? The shell. The files the company's system formally registered as assets. The tables in the shared database. The dashboard that any analyst could technically open, but which, without the underlying logic, the calibration rules, the parameter tweaks, and the interpretation of deviations, would tell absolutely nothing useful to anyone. Bradley walked past my desk as I was finishing up. He glanced at the screen, saw me organizing my files, and threw a comment into the air with that slightly ironic smirk he thought was part of his personal charm. "What kind of grandstanding is this?" I didn't take my eyes off the screen. "You'll understand tomorrow morning, at 8 a.m. He let out a short, artificial laugh, shook his head like someone dismissing a toddler throwing a tantrum, and headed toward the break room. I finished what I was doing with all the calm in the world, shut the laptop, put my ceramic mug in my bag, the one my mom gave me when I got this job, with a quote at the bottom that read, "You are capable," and walked out through the revolving doors of that floor without looking back once. Outside, the October sun in New York City was beating down hard on the Wall Street pavement. The noise of the traffic, the honking yellow cabs, the hot dog vendors wrapped around me like a strange, unexpectedly comforting hug. I stood still for a second in the middle of the foot traffic, bag on my shoulder and 3 years of my life compressed into a flash drive in my pants pocket. I didn't cry. Not in that moment. I just took a deep breath, looked up at the blue sky above the skyscrapers, and thought, all right. Now it's their turn to find out what happens when an entire structure loses its foundation overnight. I headed straight home on the subway, holding my bag on my lap the whole ride like it was something precious I needed to guard. And in a way, it was. My apartment was small, over in Astoria, Queens, a studio I had rented a while back and never upgraded from because the rent was decent and the quiet allowed me to work late into the night without guilt or neighbors banging on the walls. As the subway rocked between stations, I kept replaying everything in my head with a clarity that surprised me. It wasn't anger, or at least, not just anger. It was more like that cold lucidity that kicks in after a huge scare, when the body realizes there's nothing left to lose and the mind can finally see things as they truly are, without the daily fog covering it all up. The Meridian Project was, in practice, a highly customized operation heavily dependent on tacit knowledge, the kind of knowledge that lives inside the head of the person doing the work, not in manuals or shared drives. The client had come to Vertice 2 years ago with a very specific problem. They had absurd volumes of transactional data, but the models they used to detect default patterns were outdated, built on logic that no longer tracked with current consumer behavior in a post-pandemic market. They needed something smarter, more adaptable, something that could learn from seasonal shifts and different regional profiles across the US. I was the one who pitched the solution. It wasn't an idea that fell from the sky during an afternoon of inspiration, it was the result of weeks of off-the-clock studying, reading academic papers late at night while chugging cold brew, testing different approaches until I found one that made sense within the real-world limitations of the client's system. When I presented it to Bradley, he took the idea, tweaked the wording to make it sound more corporate, slapped it onto some beautifully designed slides, and took it to upper management as if it were a joint initiative from the whole team. The team, in that specific context, consisted of me building it solo, and 3 other people who didn't even know the technical details of what was being built. But the part most outsiders didn't realize, and which I suspect not even Bradley fully understood, was that the model I had built wasn't something you could just install on a server and forget about. It was a living organism that needed constant maintenance and adjustments based on technical judgment. The parameters shifted as the data behavior shifted week to week. There was a weekly calibration logic that I ran manually because the client had strict access restrictions that prevented full automation. Every week, I ran a sequence of checks, tweaked 2 or 3 variables based on the deviations I saw, and only then did I generate the final report that went to the bank's board of directors. This whole process was in my head. In my personal notes. In my notebooks. None of it was documented in the company's internal systems in a way that someone else could independently replicate. I had asked, on at least 3 separate occasions over those 2 years, to formalize detailed technical documentation for that process, to build a sort of operational playbook to protect the project in case I got sick, took a vacation, or just left. Bradley had said all 3 times that it was a priority. A priority that never became an actual task, never got a deadline, never left the drawing board. When I got home, I booted up my personal laptop, opened my files, and just stared at it all for a good while, doing nothing. I wasn't plotting to deliberately sabotage anyone. It was simpler and more serious than that. I had built that with my intellect, my time, my energy, and what I had built was mine. Every line of reasoning that hadn't been formally handed over to the company through standard contractual procedures remained my intellectual property. No one had asked me to document those processes in the shared systems. And when I voluntarily tried to do it, no one had cared enough to make sure it happened. That night, I made a simple omelet with whatever was left in the fridge, drank some chamomile tea, and went to bed early. Which was probably more than Bradley managed to do, considering what was about to happen in the morning. Because the next morning, Vertice had to deliver the weekly Meridian report. A report that went straight to the bank's C-suite. A report that backed credit decisions affecting the portfolios of hundreds of retail and corporate clients. A report that, without the calibration only I knew how to do, simply did not exist in any reliable way. I set my alarm for 7 a.m. I wanted to be fully awake and clear-headed when my phone started ringing. And it rang. At 7:53 a.m., before standard office hours even began. I didn't answer. The text that came through right after was from Chloe, a junior analyst on the team, one of the few people in that office I genuinely admired. The text was short and clearly desperate. "Harper, I really need to talk to you. Something went really wrong here and I have no idea what to do." I knew exactly what had gone wrong. And I knew, with a calm certainty that surprised me, that this was just the beginning of a very long morning for some very specific people. I took my time making a cup of coffee while my phone kept piling up unread texts and missed calls. I wasn't acting out of cruelty, it was, in fact, the first morning in a long time where I didn't have to rush to be someone else's first line of support the second I woke up. While the coffee brewed and the smell filled my small apartment, I read the messages in chronological order, like I was following a story where I already knew the ending. At 7:47 a.m., Chloe had tried to run the data update script for Meridian, following the informal process I had shown her a few weeks prior. The script launched normally, processed the first batch of files without a hitch, and then completely crashed during a validation step that relied on a parameter table I maintained and manually updated every week. Without that table updated with the current week's correct values, the entire process ground to a halt. It was like trying to bake a cake with a list of ingredients but no measurements and no oven temperature. All the components were there on the screen, but the formula that made them work together was nowhere to be found. At 8:02 a.m., Bradley had arrived at the office and was briefed on the issue by a visibly panicking Chloe. The next text I got wasn't from Chloe, it was from Bradley himself. His tone was formal, visibly forced into composure, using that careful corporate speak people use when they're scared but don't want to show it. He said there was a minor technical hiccup on the Meridian project and that he needed me to point him in the right direction to locate the model's configuration files. I replied with 3 words, after pausing for a few minutes, "Good morning, Bradley." It wasn't calculated malice. It was literally just that. I wished him a good morning, just like anyone would reply when getting a morning text. But I knew that, in that context and at that exact moment, those 3 words hit him with a weight that no direct insult could have ever achieved. I only got the full details of what happened on the other side weeks later, when Chloe told me everything during a long catch-up over coffee in the Flatiron district, a mix of relief and disbelief still on her face. Bradley had called an emergency meeting with the analytics team at 8:15 a.m. There were 4 people in the room besides him: Chloe, a newer analyst named Connor who had joined 3 months ago, the project coordinator Megan, and the IT supervisor Derek. All of them staring at screens full of data that looked visually complete but made absolutely zero practical sense without the technical context only I possessed. Bradley had spent almost 50 minutes scouring the shared files on the internal server, hunting for any documentation that explained the model's logic, the calibration criteria, the weekly adjustment rules. There were tables. There were historical charts. There were results from past analyses saved in various formats. But the conceptual framework tying it all together, the why behind every methodological decision, the criteria I used to decide when to tweak and in which direction, the logic behind the model's weights regarding seasonal variables, was simply not recorded anywhere in those systems. Because it had never been put there. And I had tried to change that. The delivery to Meridian was scheduled for 10 a.m. That was when the report needed to be sitting in the bank board's inbox, without fail, without delay. Any inconsistency would be immediately spotted. The client was meticulous in a way I had grown to respect over time, and their finance directors read that report line by line every single week, no exceptions. At 8:52 a.m., my phone rang. It was the company's landline. I let it go straight to voicemail without hesitating. The voicemail Bradley left was surprisingly human by his standards, and that hit me in a way I hadn't anticipated. His voice was tense, but there was something different there. His usually polished, controlled exterior had cracked somewhere, letting something a bit more real slip through. He said there was a critical situation involving the company's most important client, that the morning's deliverable was compromised, and that he urgently needed my cooperation to locate the project parameters. He promised that the conversation about my termination could be reviewed and reevaluated if I helped fix the situation. I listened to that voicemail twice in a row. Could be reviewed. As if 3 years of the best work of my life were a toggle switch he could flip on and off depending on how his interest shifted from one afternoon to the next morning. I didn't call back. At exactly 9:15 a.m., I got a text from a number I didn't have saved in my contacts. The message started with an introduction. It was Harrison Sterling, the director of operations at Vertice Solutions, Bradley's direct boss, someone I had interacted with a handful of times over the years during larger strategy meetings, but never in a direct or personal capacity. His message was completely different from everything else I had received that morning, and the difference was immediate and unmistakable. Harrison wasn't asking for a favor. He wasn't making veiled threats. He wasn't hiding behind corporate jargon to cover up desperation. He was taking accountability. He wrote that he had been brought up to speed on the entire situation upon arriving at the office that morning and that he understood the termination process had been handled hastily and without a proper assessment of the Meridian project's critical technical dependencies. He said he wanted to better understand what had gone down over the last 3 years and asked if I'd be available to talk with him personally, whenever I had the time. I stared at that message for a long time, rereading every sentence. There was something about that direct, no BS acknowledgement that touched me in a way I hadn't expected to feel. Not because it made me want to backtrack on any decision, far from it, my mind was extraordinarily clear right then. But because it was the first time in a long time that anyone in that company used words like understand and hastily regarding what had happened to me, without trying to manipulate the situation. I replied that I was available to talk, but I had some prior commitments in the afternoon that I couldn't cancel. It was the absolute truth. Weeks ago, I had set up an informal coffee chat with a former coworker named Sarah who now worked at a consulting firm called Innova Data, located in the Flatiron district. It wasn't officially a job interview, but there was an implicit offer in the invite, and I had filed that conversation in the back of my mind as an option to explore when the time was right. That time had arrived a lot more abruptly than I thought, but it was here. Harrison called me at exactly 9:30 a.m. We spoke for 40 minutes, and what surprised me was how well he listened. He genuinely listened, asked questions proving he was processing what I was saying, and never interrupted to defend himself or the company. He told me he had reviewed the history of the Meridian project that morning and discovered the operation had been bottlenecked through me for far too long, without anyone in management demanding proper risk assessment or formal technical documentation. He admitted this was a severe structural flaw the company had allowed to fester through pure negligence, and that firing me under those circumstances was, at the very least, technically irresponsible. He never mentioned Bradley by name at any point during the call, but reading between the lines was crystal clear to anyone aware of the situation. He asked me what it would take for me to consider a temporary collaboration, not coming back as a full-time employee, but signing a short-term consulting contract, with a clearly defined scope, just to ensure the Meridian project didn't completely implode and that the relationship with their top client was salvaged. I listened closely to everything. I thanked him for his honest approach, because it was genuine and I could tell. And I told him I needed 24 hours to think it over and fully evaluate my situation before giving him a final answer. After I hung up, I sat in the blue plastic chair in my apartment for a few minutes, staring out the window at the courtyard below. There was an old, scruffy tree in the corner that no one had watered in months, but it was stubbornly surviving and growing anyway. I related to that tree in a way that made me chuckle to myself. At 2 p.m., I headed to my meeting with Sarah at Innova Data. Innova Data was located in an office space in the Flatiron district, inside one of those renovated glass front buildings that perfectly blends the old with the modern. The inside was flooded with natural light, plants scattered across the workspaces, and desks organized in a way that felt functional rather than just for show. I walked in with my purse on my shoulder and my flash drive in my pocket and felt, instantly and concretely, that I wasn't walking into a place where I'd have to immediately go on the defensive just to justify my presence. Sarah greeted me with that straightforward energy I had always liked about her, skipped the excessive formalities, and introduced me to Nathan, the partner in charge of the data division. He was in his mid-30s, spoke clearly and directly, and in 5 minutes of chatting proved he understood more about predictive modeling in the financial sector than Bradley had shown in 3 years of daily interactions. We had a long, great conversation. We talked about methodologies, the specific hurdles of the U.S. financial market, how to balance technical sophistication with practical implementation, and the workplace culture they were deliberately building at the firm. At one point, Nathan asked me about the most complex and challenging project I had handled in my career. Being careful not to breach any client confidentiality, I laid out the conceptual framework of my work on Meridian, the original problem, the solution I pitched, the implementation roadblocks, and the ongoing tweaks over time. He asked sharp, relevant technical questions. I gave him detailed answers. He asked even more questions, digging into aspects I didn't expect anyone to notice. It was the kind of technical back and forth I hadn't experienced back at my old office in longer than I could measure. At the end of our chat, Nathan said something that stuck with me with unusual clarity. He said Innova was looking for people who thought deeply about problems before jumping to solutions, not people who just blindly executed canned answers. And based on what I had just described, I clearly belonged in the first camp. I walked out of there with a formal offer sitting in my inbox and 5 days to give them an answer. The package was significantly better than what I was making at Vertice in every way that mattered, not just the salary, which was a major bump, but the organizational structure, the clear responsibilities, the explicit recognition of technical value, and the policies on shared documentation and knowledge rotation they had baked into their culture. All the things I had begged for, in different ways and at different times, over 3 years at Vertice, only to get smoke and empty promises. Riding the subway back home, scrolling through Innova's offer on my phone while the afternoon rush buzzed around me, I thought about Harrison and the consulting gig he had pitched with genuine good intentions that morning. That conversation was real, and I respected that. But I also had a very firm boundary within myself about what I was willing to give back to a place that had tossed me out in 15 minutes after 3 years of silent, invisible devotion. There was a massive, non-negotiable difference between responsibly helping out during a crisis and willingly putting myself back into a position of emotional dependence and vulnerability inside a structure that had already proven it didn't value me. I decided I would get back to Harrison with a pitch for a very short-term consulting gig, a strictly defined scope, a rate that reflected the actual value of the work, and zero implicit or explicit promises of sticking around. If the company needed my technical chops to keep their relationship with Meridian from sinking, fine. But this time, there would be an ironclad contract signed before a single meeting started, a fair price negotiated up front, and absolutely no expectation that my hard work could just be taken for granted. I called Harrison the next morning and laid out my terms without a stutter. He heard me out, asked for a day to get the green light from the board, and called back the following day with a yes. In the meantime, I replied to Innova's offer with one word, yes. The consulting contract with Vertice was signed exactly 5 days after I was let go. 3 technical knowledge transfer sessions, 4 hours each, at an hourly rate that added up to more than I used to make in a full month as their employee. Everything laid out in the contract, a detailed scope of work, signed by both parties before any meeting even kicked off. During the sessions, I was thorough, meticulous, and absolutely professional. I documented every relevant process, explained the rationale behind every methodological choice, and recorded detailed voiceover tutorials for the most complex steps. Not because I felt any lingering emotional loyalty to that place, I didn't. But because the project involved a real client with real needs, and that client had never done me any wrong. Keeping those things separate was just basic integrity. Chloe was there, completely dialed into all 3 sessions, soaking up everything with such sharp focus and asking such smart questions that it genuinely broke my heart a little to think about how underutilized and underestimated she had been in that environment, the exact same way I had been. I gently brought it up to her during a break. She stayed quiet for a long second before just replying, I know. I've known for a while. Bradley didn't show his face in any of the 3 sessions. I found out later, through Chloe, that he had been stripped of his direct management role over the Meridian project right after the botched delivery incident. The company officially spun it internally as a portfolio reorganization, but anyone who knew the facts knew exactly what it really was. The same week I wrapped up my final consulting session and got paid in full, I officially started my new job at Innova Data. The first day was one of those days you mentally bookmark because you know you'll want to remember it. Nathan introduced me to the team in a quick, casual huddle, no pomp, no slide decks, no long-winded speeches. He just said I was there to add value and that he was stoked about what we could build together. After that, he showed me to my desk, my new laptop already fully configured, and told me to spend the rest of the day getting settled, exploring the systems, and asking anybody whatever questions I had. No deliverables today. Just observe, explore, and ask away. I stared at that desk for a quiet moment, my mom's mug already sitting in the corner, thinking about how much of my life I had spent sitting at a desk feeling like I constantly had to justify my existence, like I had to prove every single day that I deserved to keep my seat. Here, nobody had asked me for a justification yet, and I had a clear feeling they never would. 2 months into my time at Innova, I was named the technical lead on a new strategic project, a partnership with a regional fintech company looking to build a risk analysis model for microloans. It was a sector with completely different dynamics than traditional corporate credit, carrying a real social impact that I found genuinely inspiring. It was exactly the kind of complex, multi-layered problem with no off-the-shelf solution that made me want to get into this field in the first place. This time, I documented every step of the process from day one. Not because I was forced to, because I chose to. I taught the team my reasoning right alongside the solution itself. I set up a knowledge transfer system that actually worked, one that got used in the real world, one the team checked and updated without needing me to handhold them through every little detail. No critical piece of that project lived exclusively inside my head. And at no point, not a single week during those months, did I have to work until midnight on a holiday weekend without anyone knowing or caring that I had done it. Almost a year to the day after Bradley gave me 15 minutes to pack my bags, I was sitting in a plush chair at a long table on the 12th floor of a hotel in downtown Manhattan. It was the annual awards gala for tech and financial innovation, an event I used to follow from a distance over the years, never dreaming I'd actually be there as a nominee. Innova had been shortlisted in one of the premier categories for a risk analysis project our team had built over those months, the microloan project I had served as technical lead on. I was wearing a navy blue blazer I had bought on a lazy Saturday morning, no rush, in a store I walked into because I actually wanted to, not because I needed to look like something for someone else. I sat next to Nathan and Sarah, feeling that easy, natural vibe you get when you've spent months truly building something together. When Innova's name was called as the category winner, the three of us stood up together so spontaneously it didn't need to be rehearsed. Walking up onto that stage felt weird and amazing all at once. Not because I didn't feel I deserved it, I absolutely did. But because it was the first time someone was acknowledging, out loud, in front of an entire room full of industry peers, a piece of work I had done, with no middlemen standing between the work and the recognition. Without someone else grabbing the mic in my place after I had built the very thing winning the award. I kept it brief, as is my style. I thanked the Innova team with total sincerity, Nathan for trusting me from day one, and Sarah for giving me a call right when I needed an open door the most. I said it was a truly collaborative effort, that every single person on the team brought something to the table I never could have managed on my own, and that's what makes all the difference in a result like this. When I got back to my seat, my phone buzzed with a text from Chloe. She had seen the event coverage on Innova's social media and reached out to congratulate me with that simple, sweet generosity that was so totally her. I texted back a heart emoji, smiled at my screen for a second, and put my phone away. Later that night, during a lull between conversations in the ballroom, Sarah leaned in slightly and whispered that she recognized someone across the room. I discreetly glanced where she was pointing with a subtle tilt of my chin. It was Bradley. He was standing with a group of 3 or 4 people near the coat check, wearing a lanyard from a company I didn't recognize. He looked different, not physically, but he was giving off that energy people project when they're still trying to figure out where they fit in, that tight, nervous vibe of someone who hasn't quite found their footing yet. Our eyes met for exactly 1 second. He looked away first. I didn't walk over. There was nothing I needed to say, no score to settle, no point to prove to his face. The distance between the trophy in my bag and the unfamiliar logo on his badge said everything I could ever say, but without the heavy, useless baggage of a confrontation. I left the gala that night with the award in my purse, my phone flooded with congratulatory texts from industry folks I had met along the way, and a lightness in my chest I had forgotten you could even feel when it comes to your career. A lightness that doesn't come from a lack of challenges, because the challenges at Innova were real and relentless, but from the presence of respect. Outside the hotel, the New York night was pleasantly mild for the city, with that soft autumn breeze that sometimes rolls through between October and November, feeling like it doesn't quite belong. I thought back to the afternoon I walked out of Vertice revolving doors with a flash drive in my pocket and the weight of 3 years of invisible labor on my shoulders. That afternoon, I couldn't yet clearly see what was starting. I could only see what was ending. Now I know, with the rock-solid certainty that a year of distance brings, that what looks like a forced ending is, a lot of times, the only way a true beginning can ever find its way to you. That the recognition that doesn't come from the path you imagined might arrive from a path you can't even see from where you're standing. And that real skill, built on genuine effort and intellectual honesty, doesn't need a manager willing to acknowledge it to keep existing and growing. It waits. And when the right moment comes, it speaks for itself. Now, if you like this story, hit that subscribe button, and let me know in the comments, which part made your jaw drop. Oh, and don't forget to become a channel member to get access to exclusive videos I don't post here. See you there.